for female genital mutilation. This is from the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. And I now give the floor for 5 minutes to the author of the question, Madam Blinkevičiūtė. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Commissioner, colleagues, today we are marking the International Day of Combating against FGM. This urges us to take more resolute action against this problem. According to the WHO, currently about 200 million women and girls worldwide are living with the consequences of FGM. And the European Institute for Gender Equality reports victims in at least 13 member states. So the FGM, alongside other gender-based violence, is violence against the body of the women, and sometimes affects not only the security and bodily integrity of women, but also their right to life. In the European Parliament, we are especially concerned with the effectiveness of ways to protect women from this phenomenon. Only a few court cases have been initiated so far. Therefore, we should remove all barriers to initiating such cases, first of all taking into considerations the interests of a child, because very often this practice is against underage girls. Therefore, we should ensure that criminal persecution could be possible, that it would serve as a deterrent to protect potential victims. It must also be said that FGM is one of the most predictable forms of gender-based violence, and therefore I should urge the Commission and Member States to guarantee strong preventive action in refugee camps. I would like to call on the Commission to further include prevention of FGM and other harmful practices within integration procedures and the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, and to provide relevant information through the EU Asylum Agency. Another important thing would be to apply highest standards of protection for asylum seekers on grounds relating to FGM within the framework of the reform of the Common European Asylum System. Stakeholders working on the eradication of this practice advocate that cross-sectoral cooperation needs to be intensified, and this issue should be mainstreamed into all sectors: health, social work, asylum, education, law enforcement, justice, child protection, and media and communications. Since undergoing FGM or living under the risk of it affects the lives of girls and women in a multitude of ways. In all these sectors, measures should be taken to ensure appropriate protection and services to the victims. In February 2015, the Commission updated Parliament about its action on the elimination of FGM undertaken under its strategy. We would like to hear what the Commission has done to mainstream FGM prevention into all relevant policy and legislative frameworks of various of its Directorate General in order to ensure that the issue is tackled within all the above sectors. How are the integrated policies followed up, and what cooperation mechanisms are put in place? Furthermore, how will the Commission integrate its efforts and coordination of Member States' efforts in tackling FGM in the wider framework of fighting gender-based violence under the Istanbul Convention? How will FGM be addressed within the newly launched EU and UN Spotlight initiative on eliminating violence against women and girls. Thank you very much. We are looking forward to your answers.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Commissioner Jourova.
Madam President, honourable members, let me start by thanking the European Parliament and in particular the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality and its chair, Madam Blinkevičiūtė, for putting this important topic on the agenda today on the occasion of the International Day of Zero Tolerance for Female Genital Mutilation. I remember our past discussions on this subject and I am happy that the European Parliament sheds light again on this evil practice. I want to say a few words about statistics, but whenever we start speaking about statistical figures, we forget we speak about real people and real tragedies of women and children, women and girls. So let me share with you two stories. Last year, I met with Madam Aziatou Diallo. She is now 49. She underwent the FGM when she was 3 years old. Now she is the mother of two teenage girls of 16 and 18 years old. She arrived to Belgium from Guinea 10 years ago. She escaped in order to save her girls from undergoing female genital mutilation. I wish you all could meet her. Her life was not easy, but she is active in the Belgian NGO Group pour Abolition des Mutilations Sexuelles Féminines, and she speaks loud about the need to stop the practice. I have also read the story of Jana Doucouré, who is 24. As an infant growing up in Gambia, she experienced female genital mutilation. And she describes it took away a part of her femininity, her ownership of her body. Some girls, including her half sister who died from complications from being cut, even lose their lives. And we must keep in mind these real stories, real women and girls. We must think about them, we must work for them, and we must fight against those who are committing this horrible crime. Neither custom, tradition, culture, privacy, religion, nor so-called honour can justify violence. Now let me come back to statistics. Estimations show that at least 500,000 of the girls and women who have suffered from female genital mutilation live in Europe in 13 EU member states. The European Commission has been active in working towards prevention as well as ensuring adequate support for its victims since 2013, mainstreaming the importance of female genital mutilation prevention and eradication to active contribution of several services. We believe that to do so, it is important to work on different areas at the same time and to tackle the issue from different angles and across the portfolios. This is why the communication is an action plan built around 5 priority areas. First, improving knowledge and data. Second, supporting sustainable social change. Third priority, protection. Fourth, prosecution. And the fourth priority, combating FGM worldwide. Within our Rights, Equality and Citizenship programme, we have issued a specific call on projects relating to female genital mutilation and other harmful practices. The last call, worth €9.7 million, closed in November 2017, while a new call of €10.6 million will open on 8 March this year. Moreover, the European Institute for Gender Equality has developed a common methodology and indicators to estimate the risk of the FGM. Under the development policy outreach outside of the EU, we are one of the main contributors to the United Nations Joint Programme on the Abandonment of FGM. Through the programme, to which the EU contributes €11 million, more than 1.5 million girls and women received services for protection and care related to the mutilation. In addition, since 2016, the EU supported 7 projects implemented by civil society organisations in third countries to put an end to this practice. The so-called Spotlight Initiative intends to target specific issues and prevalent forms of gender-based violence in different global regions in a comprehensive manner and based on evidence. In Africa, for example, the priority is on eliminating female genital mutilation. The role of the Commission also consists in disseminating training materials for legal practitioners through the European e-Justice portal. One thing must be emphasised here. It is a crime in all EU member states. Its criminalisation is also required under the Istanbul Convention, and its victims therefore also fall under the scope of the Convention's prevention, support and protection measures in those member states that have ratified the Convention. So far, it was 17 of them within the EU. All the others who started the process of accession through signing are now assessing their legal framework. It is not always the easiest way leading to the ratification, and recently we experienced very worrying signals in several member states, bringing into the discussion the issues of ideology and religion. But the Convention is clearly about protecting girls and women from violence based on the fact that they are women, nothing else and nothing less. The efforts to combat FGM and support its victims are integrated in the EU legislation, notably the Victims' Rights Directive. The reform of the Common European Asylum System put forward by the Commission in 2016 aims to reinforce the protection safeguards available to persons with special needs seeking asylum in Europe. Relevant provisions to the Reception Conditions Directive provide that victims should receive the necessary medical and psychological treatment, and staff working with them should have appropriate training. Female genital mutilation has to stop in Europe. It is a crime in all member states, but girls continue to be cut. The legal framework is important, but it is not enough, unfortunately. The research of the European Institute for Gender Equality for the new study to be published in May clearly shows that in order for the laws to work, police and justice must enforce them and prosecute those responsible for their crime. Training for people implementing the law is vital, combined with awareness raising of the legislation amongst the communities involved. We must work together with all stakeholders at all levels, from our political dialogues with national administration to our support for doctors, religious leaders and parents determined to eradicate female genital mutilation once and for all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner, for putting real people behind those statistics. I think that's very important in this debate. And I now move to our speakers list, and for 2 minutes I give the floor to Madam Corazza-Bildt.
Thank you, Madam President. Today, on the International Day Against Female Genital Mutilation, we give a voice to the hundreds of millions of girls victims. Let's join forces and say loud and clear, my issue too, for everyone, everywhere. FGM is a harmful practice that can have serious consequences, physical and psychological damages on the girls. We talk about little girls as of 4, 8-year-old. And no culture, no tradition can justify this terrible violence. As co-rapporteur of the Istanbul Convention, the accession of the EU, as you mentioned, Madam Commissioner, we call once again on all member states to ratify and enforce the Convention fully. It criminalises FGM, it provides strict sanctions, and medical and psychological support for the victims. Member States must do more, faster and better to combat impunity, bringing perpetrators to justice, work on prevention, early identifying girls at risk, provide access to healthcare and reproductive services, training professionals. Member States should also fully implement the Directive on Protection of Victims and consider, as you said, FGM in the asylum process. The victims should be considered as vulnerable groups. And Madam Commissioner, I fully support the EU commitment to step up cooperation with third countries, providing technical assistance to encourage the adoption of laws banning FGM and ensuring that these laws are fully enforced. But no sustainable change can happen without involving the local communities. And we need to work hand in hand with the civil society at grassroots level to empower girls to speak up and to change behaviour, to promote change behaviour, and in refugee camps, as it was said here, for girls on the move. Madam Chair, I fully support the End FGM European Network and many other children's rights champions, and I welcome them to the European Parliament today. Let's support wholeheartedly their campaign. It's about girls' dignity, it's about the integrity of their body, it's about gender equality. And Madam President, with the EPP Group and the Intergroup on Children's Rights, we continue to be committed to zero tolerance to FGM and all forms of violence against women and girls. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We now give the floor to Madam Garcia Perez for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, we've already heard figures and human examples of women and girls. 200 million women and girls who have seen their physical integrity damaged subsequent to having their genitalia mutilated. This is a brutal practice and is not exclusive to other continents. It exists in Europe as well. 50,000 women have suffered these practices. Also, in countries such as mine, we have 17,000 women who are at risk of suffering FGM. This is a brutal practice. It is the worst form of gender-based violence that exists at this time. And it isn't just happening elsewhere. So the Commission is talking about this EU strategy, and we need to make every effort and ensure that there is full political will to improve the quality of the actions that are taking place at the moment. Training of medical staff, training of people working in education, and ensuring every possibility to prevent the situation we have in Europe. And also, via the EU's external policy and cooperation policy, we need to maintain our goals high in this area to prevent women right across the world suffering this terrible perversion, because, as I have said already, this is the worst kind of gender-based violence. This is a form of violence which leads to women calling for asylum in the European Union, so we need to ensure that that's possible, and all these women who are requesting asylum in the European Union can keep their status as refugees, so that we can ensure that this reality is recognised. This is the worst kind of gender-based violence, and there needs to be a European strategy to tackle it. The UN says that we would be able to do away with this in one generation. I hope that we can contribute to that. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Madam Krupa.
Thank you, President. We know that clitoridectomy and excision of the female genitalia are a very serious form of damage to the human body. It doesn't affect only the health, but also the life of the woman, and has a very severe physical and psychological impacts. In all countries, we know that this is a crime, but this is a practice that still continues and is not criminalised in countries outside the European Union. We know that the European Parliament and other institutions should be exerting influence on the Member States to do everything to do away with this practice. We have heard estimates of about 200 million women that have suffered FGM, especially in African countries. And obviously there is a need for education and also the possibility to prosecute families, doctors perhaps as well, who subject their children who are minors to these kind of practices. So we have to try and do everything possible to prevent this and draw attention to the health impacts of this and the suffering of women right across the world. And also this is a violation of human rights. It has an impact also on the sex life of the women. So rather than engaging in sex education with pornographic images, well, I think we ought to give training to children about life in a family and focus on the human aspect of all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 minutes for Madam Milinar.
Thank you, Madam President, Madam Commissioner. The inhumane practice of cutting female genitals reflects, in fact, a deep-rooted inequality between the sexes and constitutes an extreme form of discrimination against women and girls. There is no place for such practice in a civilized society. Today is the International Day of Zero Tolerance for female genital mutilation. However, it is really important to remember that we have to fight this human rights violation every single day of the year. This is not just happening outside of our continent. This is a practice, as we heard from our colleagues here in the House, also inside the EU, in probably most of our EU member states. I want member states to mainstream the prevention of FGM into all sectors: health, social work, asylum, education, child protection and media. Cross-sectoral cooperation is the key to fight this inhuman practice. These cooperations will serve to disseminate acquired knowledge and foster an enabling environment for collective social change. And above all, it will contribute to an improvement in the well-being of young women and girls where FGM is practiced. Actions speak louder than words. We have a shared responsibility to fight this practice, and I thank the Commissioner for presenting us the concrete measures taken in order to mainstream FGM prevention. The Istanbul Convention is the first treaty to recognise that FGM exists in Europe and that it needs to be systematically addressed. Therefore, I urge the Member States who have still not ratified the Istanbul Convention to finally do so. I call on the Bulgarian Presidency to accelerate the process on their side because it is your issue too. It is highly important that the EU cooperates in this matter and finds a unified approach to fighting violence against women and to fight female genital mutilation. The time for zero tolerance is now.
Thank you. Now, Madam Björk for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. Vi är mycket eniga här I kammaren, kommissionären, om att vi...
Thank you. Well, in this assembly, we all agree that we need to do more to fight FGM in our respective countries and at the global level as well. But if we want to be successful, we need to consider this as patriarchal violence against women's bodies and their sexuality, as are all other attacks that damage our physical integrity. As a result, the fight against FGM is part of our struggle as women, as sisters, to be able to decide on our own sexuality. The struggle against FGM needs to be part of an overarching global strategy which tackles violence against women. If we are to be successful, we also need to provide training to all those at all levels who are involved in the fight against violence against women. As colleagues have said, girls who run the risk of mutilation need to be given asylum. There are many women's organisations that work continually against this phenomenon. But what we don't want is for the racists of Europe to use this kind of violence against women to support their racist policies. As women, as sisters, we need to fight together to do away with this.
1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President, Madam Commissioner. Female genital mutilation is, without a doubt, a form of violence against girls and women. It's a violation of women's rights. Therefore, there must be no place at all for that practice in our societies and no tolerance towards those who still carry out or justify it. But we won't eradicate it only with law enforcement and criminal proceedings. Working together with communities is key to achieve the abandonment of this practice. Families from practicing communities who live in Europe must have the opportunity to participate in debates about sexuality, women's rights and female mutilation. We know that the active involvement of schools, professionals and men in these debates is fundamental to break the silence that surrounds this harmful practice. Let me put Catalonia as a clear example of working hand by hand with communities to eradicate FGM. In our country, we've taken great steps into this direction and we are determined to keep doing so. Now, we know that building trust between communities and professionals is a slow process that needs commitment from every stakeholder and a sound interprofessional and inter-administrative coordination to detect, analyse and intervene in cases of risk. It's also vital to establish contacts with NGOs working in the countries of origin and to support them so that they can follow up on the girls who live in Europe when they travel to visit their families when the risk of gender mutilation is higher. So let's put an end together to FGM. It's our issue too.
Thank you. For now, 1 minute, please, Madam Aiuto.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner Jourova, today, which is the International Day of Zero Tolerance for FGM, we want to remind the Commission that we need tangible policies to fight this and to put a stop to it. These women are permanently damaged. Their reproductive system is permanently damaged. They have problems throughout their life and they often die in childbirth. It's an intervention in their sexuality, in their private life, and basically it's not acceptable that all of these things are practiced within the European Union or outside the European Union in the rest of the world. Nothing can justify such activities, whether you're talking about cultural practices, traditions or whatever. Nothing can justify it. It needs to be put a stop to because, as the slogan is today, it's my issue too. It's true. Thank you.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes, Madam Troszczynski.
Thank you, President. Figures and statistics on FGM are terrible across the world and also in Europe. 1 million victims and also in 13 member states. This is something that is all too present in Europe today, and it is our duty to do everything possible to do away with this threat that weighs on young European women. These barbarous practices are practices from immigrant communities, that's fine, but nevertheless something has to be done with them. We have this problem that we can't have people who are victims of FGM having an automatic right to asylum in Europe. I mean, don't you think that that means that people are going to be used by traffickers as well to automatically get asylum in Europe? I mean, I think what you're doing cruelly is offering some of these victims an escape route which is just illusory. I mean, I'm sure you're going to be proposing family reunification for the victims as well, but that's happening, and that's happening in France as well, because the new draft law in France on family reunification makes it easier for the family of victims to rejoin the victims. Now, yes, we need to fight this internationally, and I think internationally we can contribute to eradicating these horrors, particularly in the countries of origin. I mean, we need to help build hospital infrastructure, provide care and also reparative surgery. In addition, we can also help by providing access to education to all young people, whether girls or boys. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a blue card from Madam Corazza-Bildt. You won't accept. Thank you. We move on to our next speaker for 1.5 minutes, and I give the floor to Madam Kołowska-Rejowicz.
Yes, thank you very much, President. Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, every year 3,000 children are mutilated, and female genital mutilation is carried out on young teenage children, sometimes during their first periods. And of course this can sometimes be rather drastic because they see the inner or outer labia excised, and this creates health problems in Africa and also in other countries amongst immigrant groups in Europe. About 200 million women have been mutilated in this way around the world last year. And then, of course, the idea is to integrate these women into their societies, their communities, so that they can be given pure to their husbands. Sometimes they die as a result of their injuries. In Africa and Asia, there are legal problems, and the idea has been to try and ban this, but the results have not been satisfactory. And we've seen that in member states, we ourselves now have laws which aim to ban this very cruel and barbaric practice, but only a few cases have been brought before the courts. So why can we not cope with this phenomenon? The question to the Commissioner, why can we not apply the law successfully? Why can we not prevent this practice? We know that it's a custom, tradition, but it's a kind of violence being perpetrated against women in our countries as well. And we have the necessary means and resources to be able to limit this practice. If we take a look at the ways in which certain countries are trying to get out of this crisis to limit the damage, I don't think that's necessarily the right kind of policy, but we need some kind of policy, some kind of measures which will help us get out of this successfully.
Thank you. I've been quite lenient with time because I don't want to interrupt what are very important contributions to the debate, but just let's be conscious. So the next speaker for 2 minutes is Madam Head.
Tack, ordförande. Fru kommissionär.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, female genital mutilation is the strongest expression of the suppression of women. It means that they cannot determine their own sexuality, their own bodies. It's physical violence against women, against girls, an attack on their physical integrity, on their health. And this attack is not just physical in nature, but it's also sexual attacks, they are psychological attacks. It really is a deep intervention in the psychology of these girls and women. It's a strong expression of the patriarchal cultures of where this happens. So many women are victims of this. A lot of them actually live in my country, in Sweden. These women are entitled to good health care, clinical care, but also they need psychological help as well. And prevention is extremely important as well, so that these kind of attacks are put a stop to for good. We need more cooperation between everybody in society, all of these people involved, institutions as well. We need to eradicate this at institutional level, at country level, at EU level, because the dimensions of the problem are huge. Health and protection of children, because it's particularly young girls that are affected by this. This question should never be dealt with in isolation. It cannot happen. It has got to be dovetailed with other issues, because so many things come into play here. It's a question of violence against women. It's 2018, after all. It's high time that member states start to take self-determination of women seriously. Thank you.
And now for 1 minute, Mr. Gericke.
Frau Vorsitzende.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. FGM means the partial or full excision of the inner or outer labia. All forms of this are terrible, but we need to be clear that this is something that young women and girls are going through this right across the globe. We're talking about hundreds of millions of young women, not only in Africa and the Middle East, but also here in Europe. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mrs. Walter-Killian, who gave me information on this. 180,000 women are affected by this terrible fate in Europe, and even in Germany, at least 25,000 women are affected. FGM is clearly violence. It is not a religious act. It's no tradition. It needs to be banned and persecuted. We need to ensure that those who are affected are guaranteed protection in Europe, and we need to fight for that in Europe and across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Bilbao Baracenda.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, eradicating female genital mutilation is a task which is going to take quite a long time. It will only be successful if we focus on the perspective of human rights, protecting children, and gender policies. The key is prevention. In order for this to be effective, it's absolutely essential that the communities that are bringing together, incorporating at-risk groups of people, also participate in a task, in work that is affecting all of us. We have to focus on integration into the community and intercultural integration, and give the necessary support and backup for social assistance, health and education assistance.
Yes, Madam, sorry, a little bit slower, please.
We can't fall into the area of stigmatizing or creating a double victimization of people at risk through genital mutilation. Convincing, empowering, and tackling the beliefs that give rise to this practice, the keys to a guide of professional activity that we're elaborating in the Basque Institute of the Woman, Emma Kunde, and which is showing up good results. How can we organise the exchange of good practices in this field in order to enrich the approach, the focus that we have adopted in order to fight genital mutilation in the European Union? Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to listen to the end of your contribution before I give the floor now for 1 minute to Madam Reintke.
Women know best what to do with their bodies. Neither the state, nor the church, nor husbands, nor parents, nor anybody else should tell them what to do with their body. This is the very basic of sexual self-determination. And female genital mutilation is one of the most massive attacks on this sexual self-determination. It is violence, and it can never be justified by tradition or religion or anything else. We know what is best for our bodies. We know when to have sex. We know when not to have sex. We know when to have babies, and we know when to have a relationship and with whom. And in order to end female genital mutilation, we need to ratify the Istanbul Convention all over the European Union. It is high time. We need to act up. We need to stop this horrible practice, and we need to stop telling women what to do with their bodies, because they themselves know best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madam Parker, 1 minute.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. Today was the International Day of Zero Tolerance for Female Genital Mutilation, a day with which to raise awareness of this barbaric practice. This appalling violation of the human rights of millions of women and young girls is being applied to our most vulnerable. There were 5,391 newly reported cases in the United Kingdom for the period of 2016 to 2017. The NHS recorded that the most common age range for this vile practice were children between the ages of 5 and 9 years old. However, we know that FGM is carried out on those as young as newborn girls. These are just the reported figures. The scale of this is far greater. 200 million girls and women globally have undergone FGM. This form of torture is damaging both physically, psychologically and can result in death. We cannot accept such a crime in the name of tolerance, political correctness or cultural sensibilities. This crime cannot go unpunished in the name of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Madam Matera.
Thank you, Chair. Vorrei iniziare leggendovi delle parole.
Let me begin by reading out a statement. Had I not been circumcised, I would never have been considered a woman. I would never have got married. I would never have had children. A useless being. For them, I may as well just have died. These are the strong words of Nietzsche Lingete. She decided to submit to the will of her family at 9 years old. Excuse me, she decided not to. She saw many of her generation lose their lives after circumcision. She was a young Maasai girl who escaped and decided to dedicate her life again to fighting this damaging and dangerous practice. With the help of ANREF, she managed to study and she began to protect women, and as a result of her studies she managed to persuade the elders of her village that new practices were necessary, safer practices that have saved thousands of women. Today, Nietzsche, she is an AMREF ambassador for the global fight against FGM. This great woman wanted to change things, and as a result of her studies she was able to do that. Increased migration brings in traditions and cultures that cannot be ignored. You just have to think about all these women and girls who are second generation Europeans. They've grown up here and they're squashed between two cultures. Let's give them a voice. Let's provide them with centres that provide support and information for them and their families. Let's give them the opportunity to make a difference, as we have heard. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 minutes, Madam Neuchel.
Sehr geehrte Frau Kommissarin,
Commissioner, colleagues, it was right for everybody to be focusing on victims. Everyone that has spoken so far has done that. That's right. But I would like to turn to the perpetrators. I'm not talking about mothers who often participate, who often are there and witness mutilation, but I'm talking to the actual perpetrators. The actual perpetrators are the men that believe that genital mutilation of women is a good way of preparing for marriage. Men that don't want to marry a woman that is equal to them, that's what it amounts to, that's what it's tantamount to. And we're pleading with you, of course we have to focus on victims primarily, but our second obligation is to ensure that there is awareness, there is education that happen on the side of the men. As long as there is a demand, I know that's a difficult word in this context, but as long as there is this demand, in inverted commas, for circumcised women, then, you know, as long as men say that, I'm only going to marry a woman that has been circumcised, then it's not going to stop. So I think everybody should be involved in this. Men too need to talk to their counterparts. They need to talk to their fellow men, because if they don't manage to do that, then that's perpetuating the issue. A strong man wants to marry a woman, wants to be alongside a woman that is just as strong and equal to that man and can give birth to healthy children. A weak man is a man who doesn't want to have a strong woman by his side. Thank you.
Madam, there is a blue card request from Mr. O'Flynn. Will you accept the blue card, Madam Nochil? Mr. O'Flynn? No, thank you.
I'd just like to
excuse me, she's not accepting. Sorry. Okay, let's move on. Our next speaker, Madam Wisniewska, for 1 minute, please.
President, ladies and gentlemen, today we're celebrating the International Day of Zero Tolerance for Female Genital Mutilation. If we take a look at the statistics which concern this crime, they're quite shocking. 200 million women around the world are affected by this, and this means that we know that children and women, girls and women in the European Union are not free of this either, this particular crime. And in certain cases it's linked to migrant groups as well, things that we're discussing here in the European Union. And there has to be a greater sensitivity to girls and women who are victims of this barbaric crime. And I'd like to thank the Commissioner for the Commission's programme. We know that it isn't always successful, but at least things are being done to protect girls and women, looking at education and preventive measures. But I think we ought to take a look at ourselves. How do we discuss issues relating to women? We can see that the left side of the room, the left wing, the right wing, we don't always have the same approaches. If you take a look at the photographs which show this procedure, then awful. I think there has to be less ideology from the left side of the chamber. We have to work together, and it's only by working together that we can do something about this problem for women, and that women can feel strong and free to be able to tackle this horrendous crime. Thank you.
1 minute now for Mr. Goerens.
Thank you, President. There are many of us in this assembly. I think we unanimously actually want to put an end to this horror that is all too present in too many countries. But banning it is an initial way to move, but it's not going to be enough. It's not going to abolish these crimes, because we are talking about a crime. We need to go further than just a simple ban. We need the judicial and financial resources to ensure that our ambition can become reality. We need a strategy to do away with these barbaric practices to which millions are still exposed without defence. We need a strategy to be initiated by the Commission which provides every possible means to deal with this issue. We need the UN involved. The UN Agency for the Population needs to be involved. And we need to be involved in co-financing programmes with them. I think it would also be a good idea to ensure that development assistance aid is made conditional on the beneficiary country saying that they will do away with FGM. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Engström.
Thank you, Madam President. When you think that somebody cuts into another person in the lower abdomen and other places, it's almost, you can't envisage it. And in fact, though, that is the reality for many girls. 10,000 in Sweden are at risk of this. That's violence to women in the worst possible form. And that means that women cannot determine what happens to their own body. We've talked about this. It encroaches on their sexual freedom. It's an attack on their physical integrity. We've heard all of this, and it really is a violation of human rights. And despite that, in many member states, people think that women that have suffered this shouldn't stay here, that they have no right to stay in our countries. We've got to ratify the Istanbul Convention.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Madam Dornano.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. The European Institute for Gender Equality relates to the victims of female genital mutilation and sees that these victims exist in about half of all member states. In 2015, the Commission said that public opinion had to be made aware of this, especially that there are these groups in their communities that carry out this practice. This is a horrendous practice, and in my country, France, it is a crime and you can be sentenced for it. In 2016, it was said that 200 million women had been victims of FGM. 55 African countries are affected by this, including Yemen, Iraq, Indonesia. And 6 women a minute are excised. 6 women a minute are excised in this way. And something has to be done. It's even more than necessary than ever to do something about this, to look after these women, but also to punish the perpetrators in order to avoid future victims.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes, Madam Esteras.
Gracias. Thank you, Madam President. Well, yes, 200 million women and girls have been the victims of female genital mutilation, and 50,000 live in Europe, as has been said. 3,000 girls this year may end up being victims of this atrocity. This can never be justified by religion, honour, tradition, custom. This is violence, and it is a crime. This is extreme violence against human rights. A dark room, somewhere in the fields, a rusty razor, a broken piece of glass. All of these are sufficient to perpetrate this atrocity, and as has been said, this causes terrible pain throughout a woman's life. A woman is insensitive to sexual pleasure, physical and psychological trauma, serious pain, and some women even die as a result of what they've suffered. It was African women who asked the UN to show zero tolerance against FGM, and it was they who stood on the front line to fight for eradication. Let me conclude with the words of one of these African women. My daughter is 5 years old and will be intact. She will not be off school for even one day because of pain during her menstruation. She will be able to play and run without fear of her stitches breaking. We have an opportunity here to cooperate, to protect and to eradicate from the world female genital mutilation. We have an opportunity to go for peace and do away with a culture of violence. Thank you very much.
Is that a blue card request or catch the eye? Catch the eye? Blue card. Thank you for the clarification. We now give the floor for 2 minutes to Mrs. Ward.
Thank you, President. Hibo Warda is a Somali-born British woman. Aged 6 years old, she was subjected to type 3 FGM, the most extreme form of cutting. Farmer Mohammed is a Bristol teenager who, together with her friends and teacher, famously worked with Integrate UK to take a stance against FGM by singing and rapping. I'm proud of these women and others in my country who have overcome the stigma of FGM and campaigned to end the practice whilst also fighting racism and Islamophobia. FGM is a totally unacceptable practice, and in order to bring it to an end, we must understand the complexity of the phenomenon. FGM is a part of a continuum of violence against women. It's an extreme manifestation of patriarchy, but it is not the only one. In order to eradicate FGM, it's important to view it as a form of violence against women and girls, and as one of the multiple avatars of society's policing of women's bodies and sexuality. FGM must also be understood as a cultural practice often viewed as beneficial for the victim. FGM is more common in families where the parents have low educational background, and this demonstrates the importance of empowering women, not only when it comes to sexual and reproductive health, but also from an economic, political and educational perspective. Involvement in political and social processes is always beneficial, but it holds particular relevance when it comes to ending all forms of violence against women and girls. And finally, we must bear in mind that FGM is practiced in many countries, including inside Europe. In the UK, many girls are at risk of falling victim of mutilation. It's time the EU and Member States embrace a real and viable strategy to end FGM on their territory, and therefore the ratification and implementation of the Istanbul Convention is our best hope. We must join up the dots and understand the reasons for all forms of violence against women and girls.
Mrs. Girling, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The oral question talks about the best way to mainstream FGM prevention. Sorry. And I would like to say I think the best way to do that is through prosecution, and I'm going to confine my remarks to that subject. In France, I understand, over 120 parents and 2 practitioners have been prosecuted in over 50 criminal cases. By contrast, in the UK, to date, no successful convictions have been brought, despite the existence of a specific Female Genital Mutilation Act from 2005. We don't see enough emphasis placed on securing successful prosecution. It is not enough to have legislation in place if it's not used. Indeed, a landmark UK case collapsed due to lack of preparedness by the Crown Prosecution Service. There is clear evidence that if a mother has been cut, then a daughter has an 80% chance of being subjected to mutilation. These women are fellow Europeans. Their problems are our problems, and I would ask you specifically, Madam Commissioner, to request information from Member States on prosecutions and ask them why it's not happening quick enough and what they're going to do to improve it. Because in my view, this has been going on a long time. It's the only way we're going to make it stop.
Mrs. Girling, there's a blue card from Mr. O'Flynn. Will you accept?
No, Madam President, I make it a policy not to accept from UKIP. I don't give them any more oxygen.
Thank you for the clarity of your position. We now move to Mr. Szczecina for 1.5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for the floor. Vážená paní komisařko.
Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, female genital mutilation is a barbaric custom. There are now in the world some 200 million women who were subjected to this humiliating and dangerous procedure. Some 15 years ago, I lived in Kenya as a documentary filmmaker, and I was commissioned to make a documentary about female genital mutilation. I made the documentary in a village of the Samburu tribe. The documentary was called Josephine, an African story. And I can describe what the genital mutilation looked like, although men were not admitted. We had to have a female cameraman who shot the procedure for us. Josephine, the 12-year-old girl, was lying outside her hut on the ground. The actual procedure was carried out by an elderly woman. It took around 5 minutes. Then they carried Josephine to the hut, and while the men were dancing outside and celebrated by drinking tea with milk. There is a reason for telling you all this, ladies and gentlemen. There is a prejudice in Europe that in Africa this medieval custom is only practiced by Muslims, but it is not true. Josephine was Christian, her parents were Christian, as well as the female elderly and all of the other members of the Samburu tribe who were Christianized by Italian missionaries a long time ago. The barbarity of female genital mutilation is not a result of religion. It has nothing to do with religion. It is a result of primitive tribal custom. Thank you.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes. Monsieur Martin.
Oui, Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, of course, FGM is a barbarous act which I
do condemn. However, there are also some barbarous words being spoken, and I would point out that pain has neither a border nor a political hue. It's universal, like the law. And I would like to say to the Commissioner that the years go on and it's the same debate over and over. And despite our grandiloquent speeches, these barbarous acts are ongoing and it's criminal. Nonetheless, by 2030, unfortunately, 15 million new victims will add to their ranks. What are we doing? Well, I look at the Spotlight initiative from the Commission with a great deal of hope. Hope that we will have some reassurance about the genuine effects that this will have on women and girls. Perhaps this will go on until there is development for these young people. Their suffering is going to go on nonetheless. There are two major commitments that need to be met. Firstly, access to health. We must increase family planning financing. The Commission must increase its family planning financing commitments by 2020, and we need to put sexual health on our budget priorities and stop being hypocritical. And then education for all men and women. No tradition justifies this sexual violence. That's why funding of family planning is a crucial priority. I'm not the one saying it. It's Salamita, a young Malian of 14 years of age. She says that she's learning a great deal about health. She's learned the consequences of FGM. And now she's listened to by her family because this is coming from a health centre that this sort of thing is being said. And it's thanks to these girls that will save all the future generations. So, Commissioner, please, it's enough. We've had enough of speeches. We must have action straight away.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Madam Jimenez. Sorry, I'm having a problem, but I'll get there. Jimenez Becerril. I tried.
Thank you very much, President. So we are raising our voice along with hundreds of thousands of women who have suffered FGM, because it is one of the most serious violations of human rights, and it is not one right which is violated, but numerous. Body integrity, justice, so many different aspects of individuals are violated with this particular act. But how can a father say to a daughter who's going to be mutilated and to put 4 brothers there to hold guard while this terrible thing is being done, or using electric shock furthermore in order to facilitate this particular mutilating process? So this thing is horrible, and people's souls have been totally forgotten in this entire issue, and laws are not being respected, and we can't there are 50,000 young women in Europe as well that have suffered this. Hundreds of thousands are waiting for this terrible fate as well. So zero tolerance is horrible, and it is absolutely necessary to have zero tolerance towards this terrible act and to fight the impunity that exists as well. Prevention, education, and making people aware of this particular issue is key, because people ought to understand that these are victims and the perpetrators are committing a criminal act, and the state ought to protect these individuals. It isn't an issue of a domestic, of a local nature. It is a world problem indeed. So we have to fight so that millions of girls do not suffer this particular fate and lose their dignity as well, but frequently their lives as a result of this horrible act. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Jimenez Becerril. We now move for 2 minutes to Mr. Panzeri, please.
Thank you, President. The point has already been made that 500,000 women in the European Union and 200 million around the world have suffered the trauma of genital mutilation. That mutilation reflects huge gender inequality and is a source of terrible discrimination against women and girls. This denies their right to health, safety and physical integrity. It's crucial for the international community, governments and civil society to be mobilised against this form of violence. Now, I believe that preventing this violence must remain a priority for the European Union. We must support NGOs who are working in this area and promote coordinated, systematic approaches with third countries where FGM is practiced, and we must continue to have specific prevention and awareness raising campaigns. For example, good practice in Europe was reflected in the study last year from the Gender Equality Institute, focusing on the young women at risk in 6 European countries. So we must continue all our efforts to eradicate this dreadful scourge. There has to be education, and we need to build up people's awareness far more systematically. These terrible figures emerge day after day. We need to step up cooperation across the board. I think it's important to underscore also that FGM is just one element of the range of types of discrimination suffered by women. We mustn't overlook that.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Madame Revon Dallon.
Madame la Commissaire, chers collègues.
Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, the message on our T-shirts is quite clear. Stop FGM straight away. Or perhaps we should say sexual mutilation, because I would really highlight that point. It's the sexual organs of the women that are destroyed, and it's a deeply rooted practice that this goes back to. I spoke to an FGM victim. She was explaining how she was protesting outside houses and schools against FGM, and what must we do for these millions of victims, also victims in Europe? We must change mentalities, we must promote sexual and reproductive rights, we must adapt our legislation. The Istanbul Convention is an international treaty which is legally binding and calls for the penalisation of sexual mutilation and insists that it should be duly punished. And member states that have not yet ratified it, far too many of them, should do so. This will be a fundamental step for the EU. It must be ratified and implemented as soon as possible so that the perpetrators are punished.
Thank you. We now move to catch the eye procedure, and I have many requests and will not be able to satisfy the demand for speaking time, so I will begin immediately and give the floor to Madame Giuffreda for 1 minute, and I will be strict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. In this particular session, there has to be a priority position. FGM is a horrific act which has detrimental effects on the health of individuals, terrible effects as far as the health, psychological and physical of the girls that undergo it. There are different cultural, religious and other aspects which have been brought to the forefront of this, but it has nothing to do with that. It is basically a form of violence. So this particular barbaric practice is something which violates, of course, the Convention of Istanbul, which concerns violence against women. It is a tribal practice which is used even in developed countries, and one has to understand that it is absolutely imperative to have a cultural shift in this particular issue, that individuals understand that it is unacceptable in these circumstances. Thank you.
Madam Chair, genital mutilation is a brutal form of violence against women and girls, and it should not find a place in 21st century Europe. All of us here share the conviction that we need to educate women and empower them, but that we also must punish those who force women and children to undergo this barbaric procedure. How did this issue come to the fore? Well, in trying to water down the dominant Christian culture and the abandonment of Christian roots, the liberals have advocated a laicistic liberal policy, and the scourge of genital mutilation in Europe is one of the consequences of such policies. World cultures, not all of them are compatible with European values. And the speaker is interrupted.
Mevrouw de voorzitter, commissaris, collega's.
Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues, on the International Day Against Female Genital Mutilation, I'm delighted that here in the European Parliament we're making our voices heard, because I think it has to be a very loud and clear voice. It has been. The figures are staggering. 200 million women and girls around the world, but 180,000 every year in Europe too. So we've got to apply ourselves to stopping that. These practices are such that they send a shiver up your back. I know a case in Africa where girls were taken to what they thought was going to be a party, and then they were taken to a room where, with filthy knives, they had their clitoris excised, followed by terrible infection. In 2018, we cannot allow this sort of thing, Commissioner. We know that we need a multidisciplinary approach. There has to be prevention and repression. There has to be action in African countries, but also here in Europe too. The President interjects.
Thank you. Mr. Schultz.
Thank you very much for the floor. FGM is an abhorrent practice, of course. This is an intrusion to a woman's dignity, into a woman's fundamental right. This practice is inexcusable. Excuses cannot be looked for, neither in religion nor in tradition. This is an act that can only be described as violence. We have to root it out in Europe and in cooperation with the UN in other areas as well. This practice needs to be stopped. Let's think only of the 200 million women and girls who live with these injuries. If we don't stop this, the number will only grow. We have to make sure that people are educated, that people are treated and penalized. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fontoulis.
Thank you very much, President. In the Flower of the Desert, the writer spoke about the horrific experience. 21 years have passed since Idris wrote that particular book, and now people know about this particular situation. But there are over 20 countries in Africa and the Middle East, Iraqi Kurdistan, Yemen, and a number of other spots where this particular practice is a common one. Young girls, totally unaware of the consequences, fall prey to this terrible custom and practice. From 15 years of age onward, they are under this particular threat of undergoing this type of summary, if you like, a surgical procedure under horrific circumstances and suffering, of course, the terrible consequences thereafter. 150 million women throughout the planet, this is the estimation of the WHO, have suffered this terrible fate.
Madam Zoana.
Doamnă președintă, domnilor comisari.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, on the 6th of February we have the International Day of Zero Tolerance for FGM. I believe this is an important day in which all women across the EU wish to increase the awareness of citizens, whatever their age or social class, to the trampling of human rights in this situation, which puts female dignity into serious jeopardy, and we must fight it. The statistics are worrying. At least in 13 countries 2 million women have suffered FGM. there aren't enough data to show the real scale of the phenomenon, and a majority of women do not report their own cases, and they're not encouraged to report their own cases. And it's worrying that the UNHCR data doesn't fully cover the situation. NGOs, the speaker stopped.
And I now give the floor to Mr. Marias for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. So, the day against genital mutilation, this is an occasion to express zero tolerance against those who implement these horrific practices. 140 million young girls and women has suffered this type of gender violence. We need very strict sanctions against this particular act, and we need protection of victims as well. But furthermore, there has to be a campaign to prevent this type of act. This is conducted because of certain anachronistic customs, principally in countries of Africa. So countries are going to have to implement immediately the Istanbul Convention to fight gender violence, and the European Union will have to take measures, the Commission as well, without these measures being an alibi or a motivation in order to promote illegal immigration to the European Union. Thank you.
And our final speaker in Catch the Eye, Madam Becerra.
Presidenta.
Thank you, President. Today in the European Union, knives are poised to mutilate 180,000 girls in our territory. FGM is a terrible threat to health and the physical integrity of the girls and women who suffer it. It not only has a terrible impact, cysts and infertility, it's a terrible infringement of their human rights. And it comes from a perverse idea of women as being the property of their fathers and husbands. So allowing this to go along is anything but progressive. In the Istanbul Convention, all parties have to stop excision and protect girls. And so we in the European Union have to prevent, protect, prosecute and repress anyone who commits acts of violence against women. I believe the feminist cause has to be a global one, not a local one, and I would call upon you all to ensure that this is rejected. That is our issue.
Thank you, colleagues. I now give the floor to Commissioner Jourova to conclude.
Madam President, honourable members, I think that it is extremely important that we have this debate, and thank you for all your contributions, because we need to understand what we face, speaking about female genital mutilation. We do not face just habit or stereotype or tradition. We face the problem of taboo, and taboo is something which is deeply rooted in the society, and it is sustainable over centuries. So some of you who spoke about the need to change the culture, I fully agree with it, but it will need more time and more intensive action, but also public debate, because one of the features of the taboo is that it is something we do not speak about, something we do not want to hear about, something which we close eyes and we don't want to deal with this problem. So that's why it's so important. Also, I wanted to thank all of you who emphasised the importance of the Istanbul Convention and the ratification in all the member states. I can tell you I have the feeling of some kind of bitterness after some recent debates in some of our member states, because I heard the opinions from some national parliaments that the Istanbul Convention goes against the traditional family, against the best traditions in the EU. And we have to fight against this opinion, and we have to convince those who want to defend traditional family by saying that it is not a good tradition to accept and tolerate violence against women and children. And we still have many member states which have not ratified, so I wanted to ask all of you who can influence the public opinion and the political decision making in your states, please do that, because we need it. The Istanbul Convention is a very efficient legislative instrument, not only against female genital mutilation but also against forced marriages and forced abortions, forced sterilisation, all those horrible things which the women in the EU still have to face and which we have to help them not to be exposed to such practices. And of course FGM is the most barbaric habit we have to get rid of. Let's protect good traditions in the EU. Let's not protect the traditions which serve as an excuse for barbaric habits. I agree with all of you who spoke about the need to come with efficient actions on the line of prevention, protection and prosecution. I fully agree. I am sure that the Commission is coming with a series of actions following this line. I only want to share with you, to conclude, some experiences from the practice. For instance, prevention. We try to involve men also in this field of prevention. We have many good reflections from the fathers who started to fight against this practice, saying that their daughters must not be exposed to this practice. This is a good sign, but we need many more to be on board on this. As for the prosecution, it has some downsides, because I can tell you we see the practice that the girl is taken for holidays to Africa, where this is done. So the crime has been committed outside the EU, where there is no European jurisdiction. And it's so hard, so difficult to prove that those who took the girls there knew about that. It is difficult to prove, but we have to be much better in this. And also this is connected with the prevention and with the need that the society must not be blind, because very often it is known before that the girl is planning to go to Africa, and at school or in the neighbourhood the people could be aware of this. So we need the society also to be active and to help those potential victims of this horrible habit. Last comment on prosecution. Some of you spoke about female genital mutilation being both physical and psychological torture. We have horrible cases when the members of the families, mothers, grandmothers, fathers, have been prosecuted for doing that or assisting this practice on their daughter or granddaughter, and then the victims of it experienced further trauma by seeing their mothers and fathers prosecuted. These are the reflections from practice which show that it is such a complex phenomenon which requires very careful but proactive approach, and I am sure that when we join forces on the line between prevention, protection and prosecution, that we can change a lot, but we have to work together. Thank you very much once again for this debate.
And thank you, Commissioner. The debate is now closed. We have one motion